So there's this Elden Ring mod called the Ascended mod that seeks to make the game extremely hard and outright unfair through a series of changes and overhauls to the game. In fact, the mod creator boasts that only the top 5% of players can beat it. So naturally, I decided to not only try it, but I downloaded the Hell mode version of the mod too. There are a lot of changes and I'll cover them all in the video, but the basics are that the enemies and bosses do way more damage, have way more health, and every single attack they do inflicts extra strong status effects. Oh yeah, there's also extra bosses and enemies within the boss arenas themselves. Now, I don't consider myself especially good at this game. I'm decent, but I'm not let's beat the game just by rolling good. And that's the idea behind this video. Can someone like me beat a mod that markets itself as unfair? Let's find out. But first, this video is sponsored by Naraka Bladepoint, a melee-focused battle royale with rolling. And rolling. Now, before they even reached out to me, I'd played this game myself last year, and that's because I had a grappling hook. If you know anything about my taste in games, a grappling hook paired with a double jump is all I need to try your game. It shares many similarities with other battle royales, like 60 players and a constantly shrinking safe zone, but what sets Naraka apart is the emphasis on melee and movement. This is a battle royale with a parry move. I parried.
Holy shit, he's a gamer!
Woo! Let's fucking
Holy
go. I paid $20 for this game last year, but it's free on Xbox Game Pass, free on Steam and Epic until the 22nd, and 50% off until the 29th. This promotion is also coinciding with two big additions. First, there's a brand new map, Hollowroth. This map has some unique features like randomly appearing extreme weather and all sorts of weird traps to send you flying. The second addition is a new PvE mode where you can fight enemies and bosses in co-op style levels. If any of this looks interesting to you, give it a shot and click the link in the description. So first off, this mod changes all of the starting classes. The gear you start with, as well as the stat distribution, is totally different, but there are still basic archetypes like strength build or intelligence build. I decided to go with Archmage for the simple reason that I figured it would be the strongest. Magic is incredibly powerful in FromSoft games, and Elden Ring is no exception. In the base game, you can trivialize a lot of the bosses with spells. Going with magic for a mod that brags about being unfair seemed like the way to go. The keepsakes you can choose are also different, so I went with the Godfrey icon as it boosts the damage of charged spells. And with that, I was in the game. The first thing I did was take stock of my character and what I started with. I noticed that all of my armor had special effects like extra Scarlet Rot resistance or extra FP. Every single armor piece in the game had been modified with similar effects, and some of them are very substantial with the benefits they provide, so you'll see my fashion shift quite a bit throughout the video. The next thing I noticed was that my weapon had an elemental effect on it without me applying it myself. Every weapon in the game behaved like this, although it only applies when the weapon is in your right hand. I think this little boost was added to help offset the giant health bars of enemies and bosses. Regardless, this wouldn't affect me much since I plan to rely on magic. Additionally, I started the game with a bunch of boluses to cure status effects, all 4 slots of talismans unlocked, and 5 starting spells. Together, this all made me a bit nervous. If the mod creator was being this nice by providing all these advantages at the start, that could only mean that they figured these were necessary to give players a fighting chance against an otherwise cruel experience. That assumption seemed to be correct, as I was instantly backstabbed and poisoned by a second grafted scion the moment I stepped into the boss arena. Fantastic. But hey, no worries, I decided to go through the tutorial cave to get back into the swing of things. I was greeted by crossbow enemies shooting triple projectiles at me, but what I would soon discover was that it wasn't just these enemies. Just about every enemy projectile in the game was tripled, faster, and had more aggressive tracking. This made certain portions of the game interesting. But good news, the tripling property on projectiles applied to me, the player, as well. For example, Glintstone Pebble fired off 3 pebbles, and that meant potentially 3 times the damage if I could land them all. The good news doesn't stop there though, because just after this, I realized my FP was regenerating on its own. Whenever my staff was equipped, I would regenerate 12 FP every 2 seconds. This was a new property added to every staff and seal in the game. I also noticed that I could abuse this effect by rapidly equipping and unequipping my staff using the D-pad to regenerate FP about twice as fast. This is what being optimal looks like. I was now ready for the Soldier of Godric. I scanned the room expecting another grafted scion to pop out, but actually no, it was just the one guy. And despite being one of the hardest bosses in the base game, he went down almost instantly. Maybe this mod wouldn't be so bad. And there's 2 tree sentinels. Alright. I decided to jump up on the ruins nearby to cheese them with magic. I then made a horrifying realization. Their health regenerates constantly. It's not slow either. The 180 damage I dealt was fully healed within seconds. And as I would soon learn, every boss in the game was like this. Oh no. The Tree Sentinel's health pool was also super inflated. Enemies and bosses now just had lots of health. Considering they would regen faster than I could hurt them, I decided to run past. In the church nearby, I found 20 smithing stones. All stackable items in the world had been multiplied by 20. I'm guessing this was a way of encouraging the use of more weapons and consumables. I continued forward to the Gatefront ruins. Along the way, I discovered that it wasn't just the tree sentinel that had been doubled, the enemies were doubled too. The mod creator was a little haphazard with it, so it's not every enemy, but most enemies in the game were doubled, and that was something I just had to deal with now. Anyway, I arrived at the site of grace and met Melina to unlock leveling and my horse. My first priorities were leveling vigor and minds. Next, I began clearing out the enemies nearby, which led to a couple more discoveries. First, the spearmen nearly poisoned me with just 2 hits, and that's the big thing. Every single enemy can now inflict status effects, and the status effects themselves have been modified in some cases so you can't ignore them. Poison, for example, is now a super amped up version of Scarlet Rot. If you don't address it immediately, you're probably dead. Second, some item locations have been swapped around. I first noticed this when I found the Lucerne in the carriage chest. I'd say most items were in their normal spots, but there was enough different that I was always checking in case something big got moved. As I continued exploring, I quickly found out that my horse would always die within a single hit. When you get hit off your horse, you're vulnerable for several seconds without the ability to move, and this coupled with extra enemies and deadly status effects meant that trying to ride my horse near enemies would usually lead to death. Oh, and here's something fun. Sometimes even non-attacks like a soldier blowing his horn would knock me off. I don't think this is intentional, but rather it's a side effect of giving every attack of every enemy a status effect. And one more thing, I could no longer use my horse to ride through swamps. It would just instantly die and I'd be left sitting there like an asshole. I wouldn't blame you if you found these changes irritating to deal with yourself, but I actually liked how they made me approach situations differently. Certain overworld locations that I'd usually just run past on my horse required a bit more attention, and horse combat itself was possible, just very risky. I also learned that enemies will spot you from farther away and will follow you for much longer. Here you can see a bear followed me well outside the forest and proceeded to punch me off a cliff. Legitimately good stuff. All this might sound kind of terrifying and miserable, but there's 2 important things to remember. 1, enemies dealing extra damage is only a problem if you get hit, so just don't get hit. I'm half joking, but this is the true advantage of magic builds. It allows you to keep your distance and generally be a lot safer than melee. And 2, I was getting way more runes than usual. Like, if I had to guess, it was probably around New Game Plus 7 levels of runes, or maybe even more. Within a matter of 2 hours, without killing any bosses and just exploring the overworld, I was already level 70. Once I had increased my FP to 160, I finally had enough to cast Cannon of Haima. That's nearly quadruple the normal amount to cast it, and other spell costs were also increased by similar amounts, so I figured that this was maybe just the mod creator's way of nerfing magic. But hold on, while testing it here, I noticed that it only took a fraction of the total cost to cast, and that's when it hit me. Fully charging a spell not only increases its damage, but for this mod, it also reduces the cost. This was huge. I suddenly had a low-cost magic nuke spell. At first I thought this was a bizarre design choice, but I thought about it and I think I see the idea. The prohibitively high cost of spells essentially forced me to only charge spells, and that's not always the best option in the heat of combat since it's much slower than casting normally. However, this system wasn't flawless, as it made spells without the ability to charge them inherently worse options. Overall though, I'd say this was at the very least interesting and changed which spells were worth using. While at Fort Height, I opened this chest expecting to find half of the Dectus Medallion to reach the Altus Plateau, but instead I found smithing stones, so apparently it had been moved. Interesting. We'll come back to this later. The next couple hours were spent just running around, killing enemies with Cannon of Haima, and collecting upgrades like Golden Seeds and Sacred Tears. I even managed to get revenge on the Tree Sentinels. After killing them, I felt ready to take on Margit. I ran to the room and saw 2 Omen enemies just standing there at the entrance. As I quietly watched the cutscene, I processed the reality of needing to fight 3 enemies at once. This seemed bad. And bad it was. Getting chased around the arena by 3 guys was an inauspicious start to the fight. This was coupled by Margit himself inflicting madness with his attacks, which, when procced, would make me stand in place for 3 seconds and almost always led to me getting killed by a follow-up. The mod description hadn't lied. This certainly felt unfair. But if the game was going to play unfair, I would too. I noticed that the Omens weren't aggroing on me immediately, and if I walked to the side right when I entered, I could avoid them entirely. In effect, this allowed me to fight Margit one-on-one. I just had to make sure I stayed within the back half of the arena to avoid getting the Omen's attention. This made the fight a lot more cramped than normal, but hey, I'll take it. Then began the slow process of me fighting a supercharged Margit after not having played Elden Ring for a couple months. The daggers he threw, while luckily not tripled, were faster than normal, so dodging them consistently was tricky. I also had to contend with his ability to temporarily lower my max HP by around 30%, which he did every time he hit me. All of this was on top of my decision to continue using the Cannon of Haima as my only damage source. Glintstone Pebble wasn't going to cut it when he had 10 times his normal health. Relying on this spell was an issue due to how slow it was. It was time for spirit summons. First, I tried Aurelia, aka the Jellyfish. Splitting aggro this way was definitely the key since it was the only way I could reliably land my spell. I would cast, back off a bit to allow Aurelia to take back aggro, and then cast again. If I was feeling greedy, sometimes I would go for 2 attacks in a row. This worked decently as spirit summons also had constant health regen just like bosses. I did eventually switch to the wolves though, as they seem to survive longer than Aurelia. The moment my spirit summons died, the fight was basically unwinnable, and to keep that from happening, I needed to pull aggro off my wolves as soon as it went back to them. And as a final wrinkle of difficulty, I noticed my 2400 damage per cast was turning into 1200 damage per cast around the halfway point of the fight. I guess this is something that was just added, but every boss in the game seems to take only 50% damage from all damage sources when it gets to half health. Not sure why exactly this was added, but sure, why not? And after a dozen tries and some patience, I eventually won. One boss down and a bunch more to go. Next up, Stormveil Castle. The first major hurdle was the dark room you get locked in. This time, it had 2 knights. I didn't have an answer for how aggressive they were, and I made the fun discovery that Frostbite, in addition to its normal properties, now also functions like Scarlet Rot. Excellent. On attempt number 2, I managed to aggro them from outside, and I killed them through the wall. Again, if the mob wants to be unfair, I'll be unfair too. Up ahead I found Razier, so this is a good time to mention that all of the NPCs are wearing different armor than normal. Some of them make more sense than others, but it was always fun to find a new NPC and see how they were changed. Kenneth Haight has shorts now. I made my way to the very bottom of the castle, where I killed a magic scarab that dropped Rancor Call. I tested it out on some enemies, and I thought it might be a solid option for later. As I continued through the castle, I found that the grafted scion that's usually patrolling the bottom of this room just wasn't there. This seemed very strange for the mod obsessed with difficulty to remove an enemy instead of doubling it. I sure hope this isn't foreshadowing something. Anyway, time for Godric. Oh, so yeah. Godric has 2 grafted scions right at the entrance to the fight, and unlike the omens for Margit, I couldn't avoid aggroing them by staying to the side. Naturally, my first instinct was to try running away. It's a pretty large room with lots of tombstones, and I thought that I could get the scions stuck on the graves while maneuvering my way along the edges. This occasionally worked, but it wasn't consistent whatsoever, and more often than not, they'd get free and chase me. Also, Godric himself was especially bad due to his air blast attack. Just like other projectiles for this mod, it moved faster and had much more aggressive tracking. This made it nearly impossible to dodge, as it would actually loop back around to hit me even if I avoided it. On top of this, Godric seemed to inflict some sort of invisible status effect that would drain my health when he hit me. It was similar to the others, but nothing would pop up on my screen, so I couldn't cure it. This all seems kinda ridiculous, so what's the plan? Well, I realized that I could take advantage of the increased aggro range enemies had by getting the attention of the grafted scions before entering the boss room. Then, with the Cannon of Haima, I could kill them through the fog wall. That was big, but Godric was still pretty imposing even by himself, so I decided to take a detour back into the overworld to get stronger. My max health was relatively low, I hadn't upgraded my weapon much, and I wanted better spells. I figured I could fix all of that in Caelid. My first stop would be the Giant Screaming Dragon. This is the classic destination for easy runes, and with how many runes everything else was dropping, I was expecting a lot to drop from this guy. So I'll just take this teleporter over here, and I'll be set to ride over. Oh, okay. Yeah, turns out the mod creator thought it would be too easy to skip the rest of Caelid, and opted to instead spawn me in the air so I die from falling damage. To top it off, the trap chest that teleports you to the mines in Caelid was also removed. No teleporting allowed, I had to just run through Caelid the old-fashioned way. This was very funny to me because, yes, this kind of sucked. Caelid was filled with extra enemies with increased aggro range, and I couldn't even ride my horse through the swamp, not to mention riding past enemies. I took my time riding around, clearing out enemies from a distance, and getting loads of runes. As long as I approached fights from far back, I would usually be fine, unless of course I caught Scarlet Rot. I also made sure to grab the Meteorite Staff and Rock Sling spell for later. It was fun hopping from island to island to avoid the swamp on my way there. But the real challenge in Caelid was Sellia, as I needed to pass through here to reach the giant dragon. It felt like I was in a war zone where I had to hide in the trenches to take cover. The amount of projectiles that were just flying at all moments was wild. Nowhere was safe. Even the site of grace nearby wasn't safe. I would get attacked while sitting down. I had to approach the town like a stealth mission by taking on just a couple enemies at a time. I also made sure to grab the Staff of Loss and Night Comet for later. After a bit of invisibility and roof hopping, I lit all 3 torches and continued deeper into Caelid. I was finally at the giant dragon. Before killing him though, I wanted to clear out Fort Feroth. I opened the chest at the top where half of the Dectus medallion was supposed to be, but just like the earlier fort, it was also missing. I was starting to get a little worried about not being able to find this. Next, I grabbed Radagon's Sword Seal. This is a good time to mention that all talismans have been reworked for this mod, and in most cases it was just a straight up buff. Normally this talisman increases 4 stats by 5 points while increasing damage taken by 15%, but now it increases all stats by 10 with no increase to damage whatsoever. I equipped it immediately. Alright, dragon time. First, I tried to bleed it like I usually would for a quicker kill, but I think the mod creator made the dragon completely immune. Though even if it wasn't, bleed wouldn't have done much as it was heavily nerfed to the point of doing nearly no damage. Luckily this change went both ways, and any enemy inflicting bleed on me wasn't a big deal. Anyway, I just kept hitting him with spells. Even with my high damage from the spells, this took 15 minutes. All of that work for a few hundred runes. Wow. To all the mod makers out there, take notes. This in combination with bleed not working and the teleporter change made for a fantastic prank. I was actually laughing. A couple more highlights for Caelid. First, while fighting this throwing knife beastman, I realized his throwing knives were consistently arcing over my head. I believe this is due to the speed increase applied to projectiles, and this meant that the occasional projectile with an arc could be mostly ignored. Second, I grabbed Lusat's staff for later. It's the strongest staff in the game in terms of magic scaling, but it consumes 50% more FP. Because of the increased cost of spells built into the mod, I wanted to save it for later for when I had more FP. I also didn't have the upgrade materials for it yet. And that'll do it for Caelid. I was feeling pretty strong. I now had just over 4,000 HP, which sounds impossible, but it's not. Basically, I figured out that the soft caps on stats had been more or less removed, and that meant that I could level up my vigor to 99 without the per level increase in HP dropping off. This coupled with talismans and armor that increased my HP even further was enough to give me that end result of 4,000. My chest piece alone gave me a 16% boost to total health. I wasn't done yet though. I had upgraded my staff to plus 24 and I gave it the Golden Vow Ash of War. The knowledgeable Elden Ring players out there will know that this normally isn't possible. This Ash of War is for melee weapons only. However, this mod apparently removes weapon type restrictions for Ashes of War, meaning I could put any skill on any weapon, or in this case, a staff. This Golden Vow skill increased my attack and defense by something like 10%. Another weird quirk I noticed is that time limits on buffs were removed, or at the very least they were greatly extended to the point where I never noticed them wearing off. This meant I could cast Golden Vow and be set until the next time I died. It was time for Godric again, with my gross amount of HP, upgraded weapon, and new spells. I took out the Grafted Scions at the door like usual, summoned Nefeli, and walked in. The first thing I did was summon the Rotten Stray in hopes of inflicting Scarlet Rot. This did not work since the dog died pretty much immediately. All good though, since I had Night Comet. This spell is incredible. The speed was good, the cost was good, the damage was crazy. I could not find another spell that excelled at all three categories as much as this one. Nefeli went down at the beginning of phase 2, but I just kept my distance and tanked his fire attacks. And before long, Godric was down. As for my reward, in addition to his Great Rune, I also got the left half of the Dectus Medallion. Finally, that mystery from hours ago had been solved, and if Godric dropped one half, my guess was that Rennala or Radahn would have the second half. The real boss fight wasn't Godric though. It was getting to the Divine Tower to activate his rune. Okay, got it. This was easily my favorite section that got changed due to extra enemies and triple projectiles. It's just very distinct from a normal playthrough. My strategy to beat this was to make frequent use of the alcoves to the side. When positioned correctly, the giant archers would hit the wall, but I could arc the Cannon of Haima over the wall. For the final section with 3 giants, I watched them for a minute to figure out the rhythm and then chose the perfect time to run for it. And it worked. I made it. I activated the Great Rune, and instead of getting plus 5 for every stat, it was plus 10. Also, because the quantity of consumables was increased across the board, I had 250 rune arcs to activate whenever I wanted. Time for Liurnia. Before heading straight to Raya Lucaria, I made a quick stop at the Academy Crystal Cave. At the end of the cave, the duo Crystallian fight had been modified to a trio plus a Godskin Noble. Fortunately, the Godskin Noble didn't have much health and went down quickly, and the rest of the fight amounted to running laps around the room while using Rock Sling to break the remaining bosses. For those of you who don't know, if you hold a staff with a passive effect in your offhand, you'll gain that effect even if you're not casting from it. So in this case, I was holding the Meteorite staff in my left hand to get a 30% damage boost to gravity magic while actually casting said magic from my plus 24 astrologer staff. The Staff of Loss works the same way by providing a 30% boost to invisibility magic, and I could have paired this with Night Comet earlier. However, I didn't realize the Staff of Loss did this until a few hours later, so that's why you're not seeing me use it yet. Anyway, I beat these guys so I could get Terra Magicus, a spell that would give me a 35% boost to magic after casting it and standing in the circle. On to Raya Lucaria. Now here's a real gamer moment. You see me dodging back and forth until they finally get me. There's no time to heal and no time to cure the frostbite that behaves like Scarlet Rot. So I made the calculated decision to open the door. Throughout this entire animation, I'm invulnerable, but the neat part is that the timer on the frostbite is still ticking down, and the animation is long enough that I survive. Do I immediately die after? Yes, but the point is that I was almost cool. On attempt number 2, I made it. After taking out a few more mages, I found the Graven School Talisman, which provides a 15% boost to sorceries, a very solid boost from its usual 4%. The Red Wolf of Radagon was up next, and he was joined by the Demi-Human Queen, who death blighted me right away. The Red Wolf, on the other hand, had moves that caused poison and frostbite. Lots of stats effects to juggle. In the end, it wasn't too bad though, and I took them both out with Night Comet on my 4th try. Fun fact, extra bosses respawn in this mod, so that meant I couldn't rest at the Site of Grace in the boss room without immediately being forced to stand up due to my proximity to an enemy. Next, I grabbed the Radagon Icon Talisman, which is one of the few talismans that appears to behave the same way as it does in the base game by increasing my casting speed. Maybe it's slightly faster, but if it was, I couldn't tell. Before tackling Rennala, I made a trip back outside to kill the Erdtree Avatar in Eastern Liurnia so I get the Magic Shrouding Crack tier. When you drink it, you get a 20% boost to magic damage, and just like Golden Vow from earlier, it appears to last much longer than its usual 3 minutes. Alright, Rennala. This fight was rough. To begin, the books that fly around the room now inflict sleep, and just a single book was enough to do it. Is this a joke about how books are boring and put you to sleep? Maybe, but the real issue is that getting sleep inflicted on me was bad. It would stun me and drain half of my 400 total FP. That might not sound too bad since I have constant FP regen, but recovering all of that takes a long time, and running around dodging and waiting is not ideal. Since Renala has very high magic defense, my only option for dealing damage was Rock Sling, since it counts as a physical attack, not magic. So sleeping aside, phase 1 wasn't too bad. Then I got to phase 2. So to recap, 2 dragons, 2 giants, 1 bloodhound knight, and 1 juiced up Renala with projectile tracking that's so aggressive that Common Azure, the beam spell, started orbiting me. I tried so many times, you don't understand. And as a reminder, I'd have to redo phase 1 each time, which was especially slow when dealing with sleep. There was simply no way to dodge all these attacks together. I was constantly getting burned by dragons from off screen while giants stomped my frostbitten body to the ground. So I started to brainstorm. My first idea was incorporating poison or scarlet rot into the fight somehow. Unfortunately, this didn't seem viable as the damage was low and it only lasted for about 10 seconds. My second idea was to try using Lutel the Headless to split aggro, as she had been pretty reliable in my other playthroughs. She helped a bit, but not nearly enough. My third idea was to give up. Fuck this fight. Technically, Renala is an optional boss fight, as I only needed 2 Great Runes to reach the city for later. And the second Great Rune might as well be Radahn since he could be easier. I ran back over to Caelid, fought my way into Redmane Castle, and spoke with Jaren. To begin the Radahn Festival, I would need to either reach the Altus Plateau or progress Ranni's questline. Since I was still missing the other half of the Dectus Medallion, I decided to do Ranni's questline. Caria Manor was pretty straightforward, so I'll skip over it. Then I talked to Ranni, then Blaidd, then Celavis, then Sellen, then Blaidd, and then boom, the festival started. I entered the battlefield expecting to see some nonsense like 2 Radahns, though surprisingly it was just him in the normal fight. I mean, he nearly one-shot me and was way tankier, but yeah, normal fight. And this arrow move looks terrifying, but it's mostly harmless. Radahn dealt bleed damage, and like I explained earlier, this meant I got a free pass on status effects for this fight. In terms of my own damage, it was back to Night Comet. Phase 1 wasn't too bad, but phase 2 was a little trickier. This one gravity magic attack was outright unavoidable due to the increased speed of projectiles, and I just barely survived. In the end, it only took me 2 tries to get him. My magic build was strong. Good news and bad news. Good news, I now had my second Great Rune and could enter Leyndell. Bad news, Radahn didn't drop the other half of the Dectus Medallion. That's okay though, there's another way to reach the Altus Plateau. I just had to go through the ruined Strom Precipice and take the elevator up. However, to reach this elevator, I needed to defeat the Magma Worm at the end. For this mod though, there were 2 at once. This was kinda rough. Even with my magic, finding openings was difficult, and I died quite a few times. Eventually, thanks to my Spirit Summon, I separated them long enough to kill one, and the second one followed soon after. And there's a wall where the elevator is supposed to be. Wow, the mod creator got me again. I didn't realize these sorts of map edits were even possible. After recovering from this surprise, I remembered that there's actually a third way to get to the plateau. I could have the abductor enemy at the bottom of Raya Lucaria grab me and teleport me to Volcano Manor, and from there I could access the rest of the zone. So I made my way down, only to find that the abductor wasn't there. Incredible. That meant that getting the Dectus Medallion was my only option, and if Godric had the first half and Radahn didn't have the second half, that meant Renala for sure had it. Back to Renala. I had a new plan this time. If I couldn't avoid Renala's attacks, I just had to make myself as tanky as possible. First, I equipped the Crimson Burst Crystal Tier, which you can get from the Weeping Peninsula. While experimenting with other crystal tiers, I found that it had been majorly buffed. What used to be 7 HP regen per second had turned into something like 50 HP per second, and it lasted until I died. Second, I activated Radahn's Great Rune for a 25% increase to HP, FP, and Stamina. This brought my total HP to a bit over 5,000. Lastly, I would stack as much magic resistance as I could. I stacked Golden Vow with the Magic Fortification Incantation and a Spellproof Dried Liver. This brought my total magic damage negation up to 68.955. So in effect, I would take 69 nice % less damage for Renala's magic attacks. Together, I hoped this would be enough. And it was. It was a complete mess of a fight, but my tankiness worked and I got her. And just as I thought, I got the second half of the Dectus Medallion, allowing me to finally reach the Altus Plateau. I rode over to Leyndell, where I found 2 Draconic Tree Sentinels guarding the entrance. I snuck behind them both and Night Commented the one on the left. Funnily enough, the tree sentinel on the right didn't turn around, so I just left him and continued inside. I worked my way through the city in what was mostly uneventful given how strong I was at this point. I was level 240 with 99 vigor, mind, and intelligence. I did not farm whatsoever. This was simply the result of me going to a side dungeon here and there and getting an unreasonable amount of runes. Look at Godfrey, look at his health bar, look at that 10k damage per cast. The only thing different about this fight compared to the base game was that there were a couple poison spear guys inside, but they didn't matter and I got them first try. Now I was curious to see what the limit on this damage might be, so I rode over to get the Ritual Sword Talisman from after the Demi-Human Queen fight at the Lux Ruins. Normally this boosts damage by 10% when at max HP, but now it boosts damage by 20% as long as I'm at least above 50% health. I had so many different items for boosting damage, and you can see the result. Morgott was up next, and he was joined by Mohg. This sounds interesting, but I killed Mohg in one hit, and then I killed Morgott so fast that he barely had time to transform. This was definitely too easy, but after Rennala, I was fine with this. As I sat down to talk with Melina so she'd give me the rolled medallion to progress, Mohg respawned right next to me, attacked me, and forced me to get up. This was bad. If I couldn't get the medallion, the run was over. I tried seeing if invisibility might stop him from aggroing, but it did not. Was this the end? Nope, because fortunately this isn't the only site of grace where Melina will speak to you. I went to the Queen's bedchamber and got it there. I took the medallion and rode up to the mountaintops of the giants. But hang on, the moment I arrived, I heard stomping. Oh, hello. Okay. So yeah, this whole area just has roaming fire giants now. I appreciate this, and I also appreciate how you can get them to walk off cliffs. Beautiful. What is notoriously one of the hardest parts of most playthroughs was up next, the real fire giant. So he had a lot of health, that's fine, that's expected, but what I didn't expect were the fire shenanigans. Fire attacks were a lot faster, and the floating exploding fire orb now exploded like 5 times consecutively. This was very high damage. Big fan of the "you're dead now" fireball move. I kept going back and forth between making an attempt and going back into the overworld to look for more tools. First, I grabbed Comet Azure. I was curious if this would be any good in this mod, and I was pleasantly surprised to see 3 beams at once. I wasn't sure if it would actually do that, since it's not really a projectile. The FP cost was massive though, so the next thing I got was the Cerulean Hidden Tier from the Ulcerated Tree Spirit near the Volcano Manor. I went to test it out expecting to get infinite FP for 15 seconds, but instead it did nothing. My FP was being depleted like normal. At least that's what I thought until I noticed my passive FP regeneration was now about 3 times faster. So that was the new effect. FP regen instead of infinite FP. I concluded that Comet Azure wouldn't be useful here, but this faster FP regen would be, since it would allow me to rely less on fully charging Night Comet and go for quicker back-to-back casts instead. And lastly, I decided to stack my fire damage negation just like I did with the magic damage for Rennala. I used the Flame Fortification Incantation, Fireproof Dried Liver, and the Flame Drake Talisman +2. Together this brought me to 79% fire damage reduction. Even with all of that, the fire still killed me. Just look at this shit. I tried a few more times though, and eventually, after a lot of patience, I got it. Fire giant down. On to Fair Missoula. The Godskin duo was up next, and the main change to this fight was that they were both given enough HP to survive the whole time. So I could no longer defeat one to fight the other by himself for a bit before the first was brought back. I think this was poorly thought out because it actually made the fight easier. They're most dangerous when they're individually at half health and enter phase 2, but they had so much HP that I only had to briefly deal with one of them being in phase 2 near the end of the fight. Basically, their health bar at the bottom of the screen was a lot less than how much they had in total together. Night Comet wins again. Rolling up to Maliketh, I saw that the Draconic Tree Sentinel wasn't outside. I sure hope he's not inside the boss room. Oh hey. Right away, I realized this guy had a large enough health bar that it would be an issue. On my second attempt, I saw that this was another case of being able to kill the enemy from outside the boss room, but I decided not to this time. I felt strong enough that I wanted a challenge. To prepare a bit more, I switched over to Lusat's staff, giving me a noticeable boost to magic scaling. I also ran over to the Consecrated Snowfield to grab the Graven Mass Talisman from the tower there. This gave me a 20% boost to sorcery and stacked with a 15% version from earlier. And just to really be overkill, I ran down to Nokron so I could grab the Mimic Tier. Honestly, I should have expected that one. Of course Mimic Tier was removed. Regardless, I was ready to try Maliketh again. It was pretty brutal still. Lutel would die right away, and that prevented me from separating the two bosses. I tried brute forcing it for a bit until I had an idea. What if I just ignored the Tree Sentinel completely? So I ran past it and focused only on Maliketh. I kept it in my periphery though so I could stay away, and because I hadn't fully entered combat with it, it only walked toward me instead of running. I also put Bloodhound Step on my staff so I could more easily avoid Maliketh himself. And that did the trick. Maliketh down. In the home stretch now.
It's a sad state of affairs. I commend your spirit, but alas.
Godfrey was up next, and he was joined by Radahn. I like it. Put the two big strong guys together. Makes sense. I was ready. And then Radahn died in one hit. Back to one-on-one. For the sake of variety, I desperately wanted to try killing Godfrey with Common Azure. Unfortunately, despite my best efforts, he kept interrupting me and I could never finish him off with it. I know it's almost as wide as my entire screen, but I think a slightly longer FP bar would have made the difference. After about 10 attempts, I switched back to Night Comet and beat him first try. Final boss, here we go. Knowing that holy damage was the main threat, I made sure to cast Lord's Divine Fortification, which bumped me up to 71% holy damage negation. It was good I had this because Radagon almost killed me a few times, but in the end, Night Comet of course came out on top. All that was left was Elden Beast. And it wasn't there. It had been replaced by 2 other dragons. I think this was probably bugged since Placidusax, who was now labeled as Elden Beast by the health bar at the bottom, had less than 20k health and went down in 3 hits. That counted. I beat the game. I know this is anticlimactic for a mod that had made such a big deal out of being hard, and this is very likely a bug, but it's also kind of fitting given how strong my character had become. As a final challenge, just for fun, I made my way over to Melania. She has 2 Revenants helping her. They attack non-stop and are probably the hardest non-boss enemies in the game, so it makes sense to throw them in here as a sort of fuck you. I would argue trying to do this legit borders on impossible. However, Revenants can teleport, and their aggro range was so wide that they teleported onto me while I was outside of the boss room without me even trying to bait them. So I got them stuck in the doorway, killed them, and fought Melania one-on-one. She seemed to have her healing ability removed, but that nerf no longer made sense without her helpers. Predictably, I beat her pretty easily. She could have had a lot more health and it wouldn't have mattered. I think this final fight encapsulates the difficulty of the entire mod, with encounters jumping between impossible to very easy through a combination of cheese and bugs. Striking a good balance that feels somewhat reasonable is tough. So that was the Ascended mod for Elden Ring. Overall, I had a fun time, and the creator should be proud. It wasn't the most consistent experience, but there's a number of thoughtful ideas here that meaningfully changed the game, and I'm excited to see what other mods people make down the line. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.